When you speak to David Gurteen, you get the sense that life is big and small at the same time. And what's small about life is our ability to be in a moment, and in that moment feel an incredible sense of satisfaction and connection. And what's big about life with David is you can see how we fit into a huge scheme of things, something that is known as long-termism or big history. And today we're going to start a conversation, which I hope all of you will take part in, that looks at where conversation fits in to all of this. David is the founder of something called the Knowledge Cafe, and it's basically a conversational process that helps build relationships and also helps us understand some big issues by discussing them. And you might say at this point, well, that's kind of what we're doing here on Swell, right? Exactly, and that's why I wanted David to come over here and talk with us on Swell, because the Knowledge Cafe is in hundreds of countries with thousands of people, and basically it helps organizations and community groups and individuals create an environment through which people can share knowledge, build relationships, deal with complex issues and really find out what the hidden problems are behind them, and really look at the power of people sitting around a table and parsing out issues to the extent that they're able to say, wow, I'm getting something I didn't get before this conversation happened. And I know that we do this so much here on Swell, but I want to drop into what conversation is really at its core and why it's so important for all of us to honor the gift that we have as people who use our voices and speak to each other. And my hope for this conversation actually is to look at where innovation meets conversation. What I mean by that is we've been talking since man has been on this earth. We've been grunting and drawing and talking, and we do this well. But now we're at a crossroads, I think, where we're being confronted by things like AI, and we're trying to wonder, where do we fit in? Where does the human voice fit in? Where does our relationship with each other fit in? And how can we start breathing a little slower? Because some of us are a little nervous about how fast things are moving. So we're going to look at all that. David, welcome to Swell. I'm so happy you're here. You are across the pond in England, and I'm so excited that this app enables us to talk as if we were across the table from each other. As way of introduction, you are a physicist, as was my father, and we kind of dropped into that a little bit. Can you talk about the connection between learning about the world through physics and then being drawn into the world of conversation?
Hello, Deborah. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. So maybe paraphrasing your question a little, what's the connection between physics and conversation? Interestingly, I've never actually asked myself that question before. Now, when I was a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, my father took me out into the garden one very dark winter's night and pointed out the stars to me, the constellations, the Great Bear, the Plough, I know, maybe even Sirius was in the sky. I'm not too sure now. But my father had fought in North Africa in the Second World War, so he had slept out under the stars in the desert, so he knew the constellations well. Now, this may be a false memory, but I'm pretty sure he said to me that scientists believe that there may well be planets, that those distant stars are actually suns like our sun, and there may well be planets circling those stars. And that just maybe on one of those planets there was a father and son looking up at the night sky and speculating in the same way that we were. That, I think, sowed a seed of curiosity in me, not just about the universe and the physics of the universe, but about life itself. And that stayed with me the whole of my life. So I studied physics at university. In my early career, I was a physicist, but quite quickly I moved into computing, and quite a long way away from physics, although my interest has always stayed with me. But coming up to modern day, my interest, I guess really from about the turn of the millennium, has been on knowledge management and how we share knowledge. Now, in those early days of knowledge management, it was very technology based. It was all about capturing knowledge and storing it in databases, which is, I think, as many of us know, has got its limitations. And I became a lot more interested in conversation and how we not only shared knowledge through conversation, but how we reason together through conversation, how we make sense of the world, how we make better decisions, and how we innovate. It seems to me that conversation is very much at the heart of what it means to be human. So coming back to that connection between physics and conversation, one of my favorite quotations, I'm not too sure who this is from, basically says that a physicist is an atom's way of knowing about itself. Think about that for a moment. We're all made of atoms. Human body is made of atoms. Our brains are made of atoms. But somehow we get to study and understand atoms. It's really rather strange, isn't it? But how do physicists get to know about atoms? How do physicists get to know about themselves? How do scientists do that? We've done it through conversation, through the conversations that we have. That's how we've always made. Since we sat around the campfires, 10, 20, 100,000 years ago, we've made sense of the world through conversation. That's the connection between physics and conversation. So, okay, that's a few words from me. I'll be interested to hear what you or others make of all of that. Okay, so bye for now.
David, that's such a beautiful sort of moment between you and your father. I'm staying with that for a second. And then the whole idea of us looking at ourselves to make sense of ourselves. I mean, everything is one big loop. And when you settle into that, when you find peace in that, from that place comes just this artistic way of seeing life, because it seems like everything's sort of this big canvas of possibility. At least that's how I feel into this conversation with you. I'm feeling very supple and open, and it excites me when a voice and a line of thinking takes me to this place. I wanted to ask you about, in this realm, in this vein of indulging in the power of conversation, this idea of listening and the art of listening and the work you do with people. You gather people, you give them this forum to look at something that's always been there, but sometimes they don't take advantage of it, and you give them that permission to have conversation, and you give them tools and things like that. But how do you discuss listening with people, and what tips do you have for true listening where we're not getting in the way of our own listening because of our own thoughts? I'm kind of fascinated by that, and since you're so into the internal and external workings of our atomic existence, can you talk about listening for me and your ideas about it?
Hi, Deborah. I like your questioning. Your question, should I say, on listening. It's maybe an area I've not given as much thought to as I might, but I do have a couple of immediate responses. I think it was Stephen Covey in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I think that book's about 20, 30 years old now. No, it's about 20 years old. He said something along the lines that we listen with the intent to reply rather than the intent to understand. And what I've tried to do when I've tried to counter that, if you like, and listen with the intent to understand, is simply not to reply. What happens when we're listening to somebody with the intent to reply? As soon as a thought or an idea comes into our head, a response, or in some way we want to better their story, we're trying to hold that story in our head, or we're trying to formulate that story in our head, so that when they finish, we can reply with our story. Yes. And because when we do that, we're no longer listening. But the trick is to let that story go. It doesn't matter that when the person you're speaking to comes to the end of what they're saying, if you can't remember what the story was that you were thinking of earlier, just let it go. It doesn't matter. Let the person who's speaking, let them speak. Don't overly interrupt them in any way. So there's listening with the intent to understand rather than the intent to reply. And then you may have heard of Nancy Klein. She wrote a book some years ago called Time to Think. And she says something along these lines, that listening is not a passive act, it's a creative act. She says that if we listen intently to what someone else has got to say, especially when they're trying to formulate their thoughts, if they're having difficulty explaining something, if they're trying to put an idea together, if you like, in words as you're listening, that don't interrupt them, that's quite simply listening intently. So maybe just nodding your head, the occasional or just where you're agreeing. That intense listening helps them think. Yes, and I quite like that, because I think that's true. And I think the problem is with listening, because I know I do it all the time. I make the mistake of wanting to interrupt, or wanting to add something, or wanting to ask a question, of wanting to build on something. And a lot of the time, there's absolutely no need to do that. Just relax and listen. So, two thoughts there. I wonder what you make of that.
David, that's so interesting, Nancy's idea of framing listening as a creative act. It's such a liberating idea in a way, because we associate creativity or creating or producing with doing, and doing is not listening to a lot of our senses, but it is very much. It's so much doing. And I was just listening to you trying to listen in a way that was creating the experience of listening to you, but not creating the words I want to say afterwards. Just the being in the listening is such a gift to give that. I think about social anxiety in both the professional and social circles, people wanting to be prepared for what they're going to say next. I think asynchronous audio liberates us from that for sure. I want to ask about the structure of the Knowledge Cafe. Sometimes I wonder how you create the space for people, both in talking about conversation and listening and speaking and the art of it, and where you think it's too much to talk and just introduce the doing itself. And I want to back this question up with the parable of a bear dancing in the forest every night, and everyone comes to see the bear dance this gorgeous dance, and he becomes very famous. And then this little duck walks up to the bear and says, "How do you do that? All those beautiful movements?" And the bear was never asked that before, and the bear stares down at his feet, and he starts analyzing his movements, bit by bit, and then the bear never dances again. It's kind of a strange story, but it really brings up the point of when is analyzing too much, and when does it get in the way of the actual natural flow?
Okay, let's see if I can't pick up on the few things you said there, Deborah. In some ways, it's not so much seeing conversation as a creative act, although I think that's the best term for it, is to see it as an enabling act. You're enabling the other person to be more creative. I guess, first of all, by showing them attention, so they know that they're being listened to and that what they're doing is worthwhile. But secondly, you're removing the distractions of you interrupting. And it occurs to me that maybe in life we should spend more time or more focus on enabling other people to do things better than trying to directly force them, if you like, in some sense. So that's just some thoughts on the listening. Regarding the cafe, I think a couple of things here. First of all, one of the principles of my cafe, and one of the things I tell people, is that it's okay to go off topic. If people want to talk about something completely different, then as far as I'm okay in the cafe, that's perfectly fine. The cafe is about having an interesting conversation with a small group of other people, and I am not looking to control it in any way. And I think this is why people kind of rather enjoy the cafe, because they don't feel they're being controlled. They can talk about what they want to talk about in the way they want to talk about it. Excuse my little coffee. And the other thing I think about conversation is just sometimes I try very hard to be aware of the conversation and maybe modify my conversation, both in content, I guess, in tone, as I'm engaged in the conversation. And I always hopelessly fail. And the more I think about conversation is that when we're engaged in a conversation, we can't actually control that conversation. It's actually impossible to control it. That the conversation is in charge. And I often say the conversation takes you where the conversation wants to take you. You're not really in charge of where that conversation's heading or where it's going to go. I guess if you're being really hard-nosed about it, you can force a conversation to go in a particular direction. But if you're just having a really good, interesting conversation and you're not overly concerned with reaching specific goals or specific outcomes, then just let the conversation take it where it wants to take you. That's what I like about that concept. In fact, the more I think about it, the more I love it. Anyway, some thoughts from me.
Hey, David. It's so interesting. I know you're across the pond from me, and when you talk, I imagine you allowing for that freedom because you're so committed to the art. I think it's an art of conversation. It's so meta for me to talk about this with you, which is one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation, because I think there's something really relaxing about letting go of the agenda, to your point. And seldom do we feel that we can indulge in such a freedom, because we're very purpose-driven, just in general, when it comes to people, sitting down for intentional connection and dialogue. But how beautiful is it to be able to be in a space where you let yourself meander with somebody? And that's such a beautiful way of being. And I wish people took more time to just have that space. I know, my mother plays Mahjong at 90. And, they have Mahjong on the table, but between the four of them, the air flows between them, as do the words they pass, between them. And I don't think they're committed to Mahjong as much as they're committed to the whimsy of being together close by on a table to just discuss life. And sometimes people need an excuse to do that. They need a setup to do that, which is what your cafe is so interesting about. For me, it's like what that creates is a dynamic that invites people to be connected with voice and with conversation. And thus this conversation can flow in any direction. But I just wanted to thank you for indulging with me here in this format. It's a different kind of format. I think it might be interesting to set up a Knowledge Cafe group here to see what evolves in this asynchronous space, where voices from all over the world can come and drop in. So I'm glad you're here, and I look forward to more new conversations that we can create to invite what you love so much about it, which is this complete human experience. It's just lovely.
Hi, Deborah. There's part of me, when I think about conversations, that says for a conversation to be a real conversation, that it has to have no purpose, no planned outcome, that it is just a conversation that goes where the conversation wants to go. And one of the problems I have with this medium, I can't remember if I said this in the last message or not. If I can figure out here how to post a link, because I think you said you can share text as well. I have an article in my book, or post in my book, on what makes a real conversation or authentic conversation. And I've got a whole list of things, and one of them is that it can't be asynchronous like this. So, by that definition, this isn't a real and authentic conversation. And I've got a whole list of things that needs to be face to face. You can't. I have a friend who thinks you can have a conversation with a painting, or a conversation with a piece of music. Yeah, maybe in some sort of sense, but it's not a real conversation. So now I've lost my train of thought on this about real conversations. Yeah, I'll post that link, because I think it's. I'm just trying to sum up. Maybe not so much what makes a real conversation, but what makes a quality conversation. Yeah, and I like what you're saying about your grandma. I think it was your grandma. A lot of the best conversations are sort of over a meal or over a drink, where you're doing something else. You actually, there's another reason for keeping you together, and while you're together, you converse. Yes. And the other interesting thing, you call it the art of conversation. It's interesting. I never used that term, but it is an art. It's certainly not a science, but for whatever reason, I don't. I tend not to use that term. But I'm not too sure I can articulate it here. In fact, I'm not even going to try. But the more I think about conversation, and the more that I talk to a few close friends about conversation, the more I realise the subtleties, the nuances of it, the complexity of it. One area of conversation that I've yet to really dig into is the neuroscience of conversation. There's a lot of with this various imaging techniques we've got these days. Scientists can monitor our brains while we're having conversations, and there's some sort of synchronizing mechanism going on when we do. But I think it's more complex. It's more complex than we realise. Anyway, I'm rabbiting on here, as they say. Let's leave that with you, and see what you make of it. And I'm going to figure out whether I can post the link here as well. Okay, bye for now.
David, what's interesting about the science of conversation, I go towards mental health, actually, and what happens to people when they are conversing. And, I call my mom every 2 days. She's 90. She lives across the country in Baltimore. I'm in Los Angeles. And I call her because I know she lives alone, and she's got so much vitality and wisdom, and like, she's such a full-hearted person, and she's not in conversation most of the day. And I think the science behind, of course, how we mirror each other and how we pick up other voices, the voice that we're hearing, and we kind of meld vocabulary sometimes. But when I think about the mental health aspect of actually using your voice, being heard, being connected with, there's nothing like it. And I know that they are doing studies right now on people who are talking to AI, older people, people with Alzheimer's, people who are just getting more feedback from something that's not real, supposedly, but it's still conversation and it's still responsive. And I think it all melds into this concept of we need to use that sacred thing that is human, that voice, to feel alive, to feel like we're iterating something, that we're being, it's like I can't explain it in layperson's terms because I don't, not that I can explain it in professional terms, but when I call my mom, I know it lights her up. I know it's not just because I'm her daughter, because we have conversation. I ask her things, and by the time the conversation ends, I know that there's a little more life in her. And I think conversation does that. It brings us back to something primal, that is just our voice in the air, hitting someone's eardrum, and then coming back to us. And it's just that thing that can save lives, can add years to someone's life. And I think that's the value of conversation at its most primal state.
Deborah, yes, there is something magical about conversation in the way that you talk about it. I think I've said this before, but I really want to find the time to dig into the neuroscience of conversation. It's far, far more than just exchanging messages. It's far, far more than just conversation in a way. There's so much going on in our minds. Yeah. Interesting what you said about chat GPT. My wife, the bank she works for is closing down in a few months' time, so she needs to find another job, and she's had quite a few interviews so far, but she hasn't had an offer yet, and so she gets a little bit depressed at times, and so she chats with ChatGPT. It's a little bit like a psychologist. I never know the difference between those two. And it's really good. It's really supportive. But it's a conversation. It's not just I'm feeling depressed. What should I do? Sort of thing. She can explain to it what her situation is, and it will respond in an appropriate manner, and it helps her. It seems to help her tremendously. Because she can talk to me. We talk a lot, but of course it's not the same. You need someone else. At times, you just need people. As you say, you just need people to have conversations with, and they needn't necessarily be meaningful conversations. They could be quite bland, everyday conversations, but they're still valuable. So yeah, and I'm sure your mum must appreciate you calling her once a week. My mum's long gone now, but she used to call me at 11 o'clock every Sunday. I probably should have called her at 11 o'clock every Sunday, but she used to call me, and it was just lovely talking to her once a week. Yeah. Conversation.
Hello, this is Stephen, and I enjoy following the topic here. I'm new to the community, and I'm here for the poetry. I'm used to the blank page, but this app has me thinking now of maybe a microphone in an empty room is something akin to a blank page. I'm very interested in language and the future of communication, how technology springs communication on us relentlessly now, and we use it to copy each other, and then we have the feeling of a common epiphany or the anxiety of a common confusion. I am transitioning from thinking of books and reading, which I spent a lot of my life doing that. And I think of it now maybe like collecting seashells or butterflies pinned to a board. And when I would open a book, maybe it's like, resurrecting the magic and the mystery when I would read it. But listening to a voice, a live voice, is a beautiful divine gift. And maybe that's more like actually watching a butterfly in real flight. Thank you for the posts that you make about this subject, and I'm going to be following them. Okay, bye.
Hello, Stephen. Thanks for joining the conversation. There were two things that went through my mind as you were talking. Both of them were kind of quotes. One of them was something along the lines that knowledge is where a book is where knowledge goes to die, and you could argue that it wasn't. Although for me, once you take knowledge and you put it into writing, it's no longer knowledge; it's information. But the key thing about it is that once it's written down, it's static. It's cast in stone. It doesn't change, and that's why conversation is, to my mind, so much more valuable. It's much more dynamic. It's alive. So there was that first quote about a book being where knowledge goes to die. The second one was from somebody a few years back, where they said, when you take a butterfly, if you look at a butterfly, in a display case with a little pin stuck through it, it is definitely not a butterfly. It might look like a butterfly, but it's dead. It's got no life. It's just a replica, if you like, of a butterfly, a shell of a butterfly, and so there's something there in that same quotation. So, like you, I'm fascinated by all of this about how we communicate, whether it's through books, whether it's through voice. I just watched a quite long video, hour-long video by Steven Pinker, who's professor of maybe psychology at Harvard, although he's basically a cognitive scientist, where he's looking at linguistics. It's sort of like an introductory lecture on linguistics, on language, on the sort of psychology, not the psychology, I guess how we speak, the mechanics of how we speak, and the mechanics of how we listen. And I think what was interesting in it, he talks about Chomsky and the fact that children are born, or let's put it this way, children seem to be born with a capacity for language, and it seems Chomsky called that a universal grammar, I think, that every child is born with, that enables us to pick up language extremely quickly. But I was wondering, when you look at the ability of ChatGPT, which knows nothing, and has certainly not got any grammatical rules built into it, there's no universal grammar, but it can speak perfect English. You kind of wonder whether the brain is not working in the same way, and that there is no such thing as a universal grammar. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit here. As you can tell, and maybe as you know, I'm absolutely fascinated by conversation, and I'd love to hear any more thoughts that you or anybody else might have on the topic, wherever it takes us. Okay, so that's me for now.